Did you know that stormy or rainy weather can trigger or worsen feelings of vertigo? Spoilers for Elbaf. However, in chapter 1182, thanks to the powers of Remo Shifu Killingham, he has made a nightmare creature of his own fears. That nightmare creature goes by the rain deity Zaza. Now, based on other videos we have made, it is very, very likely that, much like the Nidhogg, Zaza is an actual power somewhere out there in the One Piece world, and I believe Nefertiti D. Vivi will be the user of that ability. And in this video, I will explain why I think that is. So, first of all, we know that there are at least 4 major deities in the One Piece world based on the Nolan flashback in chapter 287 during Skypiea, because it is mentioned that there is a sun deity, a rain deity, a forest deity, and a earth deity. So we know Nika is the sun deity, and now Zaza is the rain deity. So the reason why I think Vivi will be the user of this ability is because I think it's very peculiar that we start the arc off basically with a reference to Vivi, in which Robin and the other Straw Hats that joined after Alabasta are viewing the newspaper and see an image of Luffy in Gear 5th within said newspaper, and he has an X on his arm. During the events of Alabasta, the X was a sign of friendship and identification, so the various Straw Hats would know whom is the real McCoy, seeing as how Mr. 2 was around and Mr. 2 proposed a actual danger because he had the powers of the clone fruit that allowed him to be a number of Straw Hats in that current group. So with that being said, seeing as how the X is a reference back to Vivi, and seeing as how that plot point comes up in chapter 1130 and hasn't been talked about since, I think we're going to open and close Elbaf with references of Vivi. So, moving on from that, another very interesting thing that I want to put at the top so I don't forget, the rain deity Zaza is said to be a primal fear of the celestial dragons because they are afraid of rain, seeing as how they live above the clouds on the red line in the Holy Land. The interesting thing about that very specifically is that the one family that disregarded the ascension to become a celestial dragon family are the Nefertiris, right? So in an SBS, specifically SBS 113, in which the vertigo dance is mentioned, and I think that's really weird because we get an image of the good and bad timelines for Vivi. In the bad timeline, she references the vertigo dance, saying that she'll make whomever she's talking to dizzy, and then at age 60, she becomes a celestial dragon, which is wild because, of course, her family disregarded the ascension to become celestial dragons. So I think it's really weird that these two are placed together in the bad timeline. But what is so interesting about the vertigo dance, specifically to me, is that it's a power that does work. And the two very interesting times that we see it working and how it's supposed to work are in the manga and oddly in the live action, because in the anime, it's replaced with perfume. So in chapter 109, Vivi performs the vertigo dance on Zoro using the circular patterns in her outfit to make him dizzy. And it actually works, as she plans to finish him off with the peacock slashers. However, Peru runs the wrong way. But this happens to Luffy in season 2 of the One Piece live action adaptation, because in combination with Igaram's saxophone playing, Vivi's vertigo dance actually manages to hypnotize Luffy and make him fall asleep. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the vertigo dance so much is because you wouldn't think that it would matter, because it's only mentioned in chapter 109 and it doesn't come up again. That is why it is strange that decades later, in a hypothetical bad timeline scenario, Vivi at age 40 is referencing the Vertigo dance. Even stranger still when you consider the live action adaptation that even though they cut out a lot of fluff from the actual series, which it makes sense for budget constraints and all that, but it's weird that out of all the things they could have cut, they don't cut the Vertigo dance. In actuality, they enhance the Vertigo dance because they make sure that music is accompanying it. So I think that's super strange. And the reason why I think there's been so much emphasis on the Vertigo dance in recent years is because the Vertigo dance most likely is the rain dance talked about in chapter 1182. As Killingham says, it appears with the rhythm of the rain dance in reference to Zaza. So I think this very weird dance that does work somehow via the use of Vivi is the actual rain dance that brings forth Zaza. And I think in the future, when Vivi either awakens her fruit or however the fruit works, she'll probably perform the Vertigo dance to summon the powers of Zaza or become Zaza. That's what I'm thinking. However, this brings us back to the top of the video in which I mentioned that stormy or rainy weather does trigger or worsen vertigo. And it's weird that the Vertigo dance is something that makes the target dizzy. So I think that's the connecting thread between the two. Rainy or stormy weather can cause vertigo or worsen vertigo, so it will only make sense possibly for the Vertigo dance to be a type of rain dance within One Piece, or something with the potential to summon rain. At least that's what I'm thinking. Now, another very interesting aspect about Vivi are her weapons, the peacock slashers, because in real life and in Indian folklore, peacocks have an association with the rain. It's speculated that based on Indian folklore that peacocks can call or summon the rain, or their dances are a alert of monsoon season starting, but that's not really true. It's just that peacocks dance to attract mates and their breeding habits line up with monsoon season. But it's quite interesting that Vivi, yet again, has a thing that could possibly be related to rain. And this time it's a bit more interesting because the peacock slashers are her weapon of choice. So I do wonder if this was planned for a very long amount of time. Now, in talking about birds, and I just wanted to point this out because it is interesting in hindsight, but we know Vivi's chosen mount is Karoo. Karoo is a duck, and a duck is normally seen as a type of waterfowl, but it's a bit different here because Karoo is a part of a species of duck called a super spot billed duck in One Piece, and that duck has webless feet. So it's not really for traversing the water. It's mainly for running across the sands of Alabasta, right? But the interesting part about Karoo specifically is Karoo is always shown with a barrel of water around its neck with a straw. So it's weird that even though it's not an aquatic creature, there is a relation to water still present because it always has a barrel of water around its neck. And I just find that kind of interesting. Very small, but interesting. But to continue. Now, taking things back to Zaza and her appearance in chapter 1182, it appears as though she's a mixture of two different cultures because her overall garb looks like something reminiscent of something you would find in Alabasta. She vaguely looks like a belly dancer of sorts. There is a slight Arabian tint to her design. But on top of that, she seems to be wearing a casa hat, something that's usually found in Wano. Now, relating this back to Vivi, we've seen Vivi in Alabastian garb before, and when she looks like a belly dancer, that much is true. But when it comes to the Wano connections, there are a few interesting ones for Vivi. One that's pretty on the nose and another that's kind of odd. So when you look at One Piece Magazine Volume 10, Vivi is given a special artwork in which she's shown in samurai armor alongside Karoo, which seems very weirdly out of place because she has no relation to Wano, and the only samurai she would know at this point in the narrative is Zoro, which is kind of funny because she has 3 swords on her side, so I don't know what that's about. But to continue, another very interesting one that was pointed out by a member of my Discord and a moderator of my Discord, KMDP, is that in chapter 217, there is a color spread and a continuation of a cover story, specifically Hachi's cover story. We'll get to that in a second. But as he pointed out, it's very interesting that this occurs because that normally isn't the case. If you get a color spread, there usually isn't a cover story preceding that. It's usually one or the other. But in this color spread specifically, a few things I need to point out are here. One, Luffy and Vivi seem to have alternating color schemes because Vivi is in red and Luffy is in blue and yellow. But what's also quite interesting here is that Vivi is in a hat, a very big brim hat. That's not necessarily a Casa hat, but this big hat look is also quite a notable look for Vivi because it's used to be the cover for One Piece Law Collection Vivi, which seems very specific if you ask me. Very odd. But in addition to that, it's also quite interesting here that we have a squirrel in a helmet. And just recently in the manga, as predicted by me 3 years ago, we have the user of the Ratatasker fruit, Ragnir. So I find that quite odd. Now, the location of which this takes place is very ambiguous, but it could be Little Garden, but it could also be Elbaf. I'm not too sure on that. But getting back to the cover story that is alongside this color spread, it's interesting that in the Hachi's Walk on the Sea4 cover story, there is a green devil fruit that shows up in the refrigerator of a panda shark. So perhaps that devil fruit is the Zaza fruit that we're looking for. And it's quite strange that this appears alongside a color spread showing off Vivi. Now, going back to Zaza, Zaza, of course, has 4 arms, right? The interesting thing about this chapter specifically is that this is the chapter in which the Straw Hats find that Robin has stowed away on the ship after crying about leaving Vivi behind in Alabasta. And of course, Robin, previously known as All Miss Sunday, has the powers of the flower fruit in which she can spawn any limb of herself on any surface, including people and herself. The interesting thing about this now is that Zaza is a 4-limbed creature. So it's weird that we're leaving Vivi behind in chapter 217 with a color spread depicting Vivi in a big hat while introducing a character that can spawn multiple limbs in this chapter. And then we have a cover story in which a devil fruit appears in, which, thinking about that now very specifically, that's never the case. Devil fruits don't appear in cover stories. And on top of that too, just for icing on the cake, Hachi himself is a multi-limbed creature of the ocean. So I think all these things are quite odd and they could come together at a point. What's also quite strange about Hachi specifically and the involvement of all this is because he has the mark of the sun on his forehead from Fisher Tiger. And of course, the mark of the sun is supposed to invoke Nika, another deity mentioned alongside the rain deity in the Skypiea flashback. So that's a little strange. It's a little strange, and I think all this is connected. But to continue, the reason I think Zaza has elements of Alabasta and Wano in her design is because I think there is a connection between the two nations, seeing as how the instructions of where Pluton is buried are found in Alabasta, but the actual weapon is below Wano. And it's below Wano after Wano has been submerged under the ocean, which is interesting. So I wonder, in the past, did Zaza flood Wano to further cover up the existence of Pluton? And now I'm thinking to put another element in the mix, seeing as how the Nidhogg and Nika seem to be connected somehow, with the Nidhogg being the harbinger of Nika's arrival. I wonder, seeing as how the Akuchi no Mikami is the guardian deity of Wano, is that devil fruit or that deity the servant of Zaza and the guard dog of Pluton? Because that's very strange to me that we have such an important deity coded and the first deity coded devil fruit present in Wano, and now Pluton, a thing that was talked about in Alabasta, is in Wano. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking the reason why Zaza has elements of both cultures in their design is because the two cultures are connected. And possibly their guard dog is the guardian deity of Wano, the Akuchi no Mikami. That's what I'm getting to. And I talk about that in my reaction to chapter 1182 by bringing it up again here because it is relevant. Now, going back to Robin, I think she kind of completes the loop here, because this is a chapter, meaning chapter 217, in which Robin is introduced to be a part of the crew moving forward, right? However, when you talk about chapter 1130, it is Robin who points out the weird X mark on Luffy in the newspaper while he's in Gear 5th. So I think it's interesting that we start with Robin and then we loop back around again to Robin when this whole Vivi being in Elbaf thing kicks off. What's also quite interesting about this is that for my 2-year anniversary for the channel, I often talk about Vivi having a Zoan fruit. Now, that Zoan fruit in the video was referring to the cat fruit model Black Cat. However, I do not think that is the case now, but I do think the original idea of her being a Zoan fruit user is going in the right direction, because most likely the Zaza fruit is a Zoan fruit. And I think it's quite interesting that the first sign of Vivi is actually being placed on a Zoan fruit user in Luffy, who just so happens to be a deity fruit user comparable to Zaza in being Nika. So I think that's a smoking gun to tell us that yes, Vivi 2 will be a mythical Zoan fruit user in the future. But to add on to that, in my 2nd anniversary video as well, I mentioned that Vivi, if she does join the Straw Hat crew in the future, which I think she will most likely be the first mate, because it has been confirmed several times now that Zoro is not the first mate. But the reason why I said that is because she has always been the diplomatic foil to Luffy, and you see that throughout the narrative when she's going about with the Straw Hats in the pre-time skip. So I could see a return of that when she joins, which would be very interesting, because as a Yonko organization now, the Straw Hats are a world power with many forces under their belt. So it will be interesting to see someone like her be in command of those forces, especially seeing as how she has a political background. So that creates a very interesting dynamic for the story in the future. And now with her possibly being the user of the Zaza fruit, she is a compliment to Luffy in more ways than one, because I'm willing to bet there is some sort of lore that we aren't privy to yet between Zaza and Nika, seeing as how both of them are feared by the world government in some respect. So I could see them coming together in one crew being big trouble for the antagonist in the future. But now for the last point, and this is the most simplistic point, but it is an important point, and a lot of people have been bringing this up. But the name Zaza has the same spelling and cadence as most of the royal women that we know of from the Nefertiti family from Alabasta. So Vivi, Lily, Titi, it's all very, very similar. So there is a very good chance that Zaza could be from Alabasta or is in Alabasta's lore in the future, but time will tell. With that being said, if you are liking the video so far, click the like button. And if you want to see more from me, click the subscribe button, followed by that bell so you never miss a video. In addition to, please hit the hype button because it really does help. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Waxy.